Dun, dun, dun. Oh, perfect. So thank you for that introduction and for explaining something about the project. We'll talk about how the project came together, why we convened it when we did. Of course, we convened it and then the pandemic intervened, so it continued on a bit longer than we'd originally planned. Briefly give our definition of crowdsourcing, talk about how we embodied our values in how we designed the Collective Wisdom project, and show you the Collective Wisdom Handbook. And then we've got 3 sections addressing what's great about crowdsourcing now, what's less great, and what does this mean for your projects. So if you're familiar with the Even Better If format for giving feedback, in a way, that's what we've done to the field today. And next slide, please, Sam. Brilliant, thank you. So we convened the project, the Collective Wisdom project, or applied for the funding because we were very aware that crowdsourcing is becoming more and more popular. Ben Brumfield and I taught HILT back in, I want to say 2014 or 15, quite some time ago. And more digital humanities summer schools and various courses have been teaching crowdsourcing, and practitioners have been learning from each other. So it seemed like a great moment to consolidate the practice that we had, to find a way to give practitioners time to document their practice, because that isn't naturally built into the way that we work in the cultural heritage sector. We wanted to support people coming into the field to ensure that they knew something of how the field came to be in the state that it is and how we think about things, being very aware of the fact that in the commercial sector and even in some academic crowdsourcing practice, it's thought of very differently. It's a non-voluntary activity. It's more mechanical Turk and getting through work to meet deadlines. We're also very aware that as new methods, particularly fuss around AI methods, human computation, the human in the loop, that we wanted these new methods to bring in the values that we think are important from our work in cultural heritage and our work thinking very much of crowdsourcing as a voluntary activity that engages certain values. So you can find out a lot more about the project on the collectivewisdomproject.org.uk, and we're very grateful to our funders at Arts and Humanities Research Council, and thank you, Melissa, for mentioning them already. And I think the next slide is Sam.
It is indeed. So even though everyone here is almost certainly familiar with crowdsourcing as a practice, we did want to share the definition of the term that we have used throughout the Collective Wisdom Project, which is a form of digitally enabled participation that promises deeper, more engaged relationships with the public via meaningful tasks with cultural heritage collections. And we really consider this a framework, one that is closely related to citizen science and history, online volunteering, which borrows from community organizing and computer-supported cooperative work, and which also intersects with practice and theory in digital humanities and learning-based digital engagement. And we chose to carry forward this definition because we think it can help guide organizations and the people who are leading projects to design coherent experiences that are productive and engaging, and which are connected to mission and values of those host organizations. And so now I will turn it over to Meghan.
Thanks, Sam. So a particular impetus for our project proposal was the shared belief that we all hold that crowdsourcing practices and communication and outcomes really can be designed ethically and equitably as possible, although that is a challenge. We have to put explicit emphasis on it. So as we started the project, we really knew that we would benefit from expressly articulating values and sets of values that could help us guide our planning and decision-making throughout the activities. And our overarching values also connected to specific ways that we've enacted those values as foundational to the events of this grant, including the call for participation in the book sprint and the book sprint itself, and the open comment period and the workshop. Next slide, please. And it's one thing to set out your values, but actually bringing them into practice becomes a little bit more complicated, and it requires emphasis and focus on these the values. So we applied our experience in designing crowdsourcing projects and especially communicating with participants and collaborators and colleagues into the collective wisdom project design. And one of the first places we found the opportunity to operationalize our values was when we had to rethink actually what we were going to do with our approach to the book sprint as the global pandemic took hold. And in particular, in a time when most participants were working remotely, some from home or other places where they did not usually undertake their work. And book sprints by design are really meant to be very intensive activities, time-bound and generative, and engaging in this type of immersive process within one's remote working environment really could put a strain on our collaborators, and it could put a strain on ourselves as well. So we thought about some of the ways we could acknowledge the impact of collaborating from home for long days, including negotiating for per diems to cover expenses such as equipment and meals, and offering financial support for the various ways that people might need to cover caregiving responsibilities. And we brought that forward, and we shared these values in advance with our participants as well, so that book sprint participants and actually the facilitators of the book sprint as well could review them and respond to, expand, or ask for clarification of those values. We were really aware that the various aspects of privilege affected who was able to respond to our call for participants. And we wanted to find other ways to address that with surveys that allowed stakeholders and volunteers who couldn't participate to share their perspectives. And by planning an open period of comment, we really were able to have the first version of the book, and we ensured that we had many more forms of feedback than we might have if we had only kept to the small group of book sprint participants. We also tried to ensure that we had a technical platform that would support access and comment for a wider period. So I'm going to hand this back over to Sam.
And speaking of the book, before we dive into the main sections of our talk, I just want to note you can read the Collective Wisdom Handbook in full via this link. It is open access and licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License. And now back over to Mia.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sam. So I get to do the fun bit, which is looking at what's great about crowdsourcing right now. And on the next slide, you'll see that the first aspect is growth, just the sheer size of the field. Its scale always changes things in one way or another. So we've sort of moved from a field with small, very bespoke, sort of handcrafted, almost experimental and quite isolated projects where people did find each other because we are on the internet after all, but didn't necessarily have any format or program for getting together. So as the field has grown, we've seen a huge range of tools available and platforms to choose from, not only from the page at Zooniverse and various others. We've seen a developing community of practice, which I think this symposium is a fantastic example of, and just seeing the way that people are taking this work forward is really inspiring. We're also seeing many more participants having much better experiences, and we're very aware of the wisdom that the participants have about the field as much as the practitioners and organizations do. So to go into these aspects in a little more detail, next slide. Great. It's hard to remember how difficult it was to explain crowdsourcing in the early days, and for the first good number of years, where now it's a quite established practice in many organizations. In some organizations, we have permanent members of staff or groups that are tasked with running crowdsourcing work. Crowdsourcing activities, engagement, connections, relationships are celebrated by leadership. And I think because of the pandemic, we're also seeing people who wouldn't previously have thought of volunteering via something like crowdsourcing now think of it as being a viable alternative for online volunteering. So all aspects, all parties to the relationship in some ways have recognized crowdsourcing as having a growing legitimacy. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned platforms. The fact that it's so easy to get started now is really incredible. The overhead in setting up a platform, working out user logins, all the mechanics of working with like how you aggregate and hand out tasks, that's managed by platforms now. So you can get started really, really quickly. That means you've got more time to think about what it is that you want to do, how you'll use the data, how you'll prepare it before and after. So it's quite possible to use off-the-shelf tools or borrow someone else's Python scripts, or sort of string things together using tools that already exist. And we're seeing people develop quite complex workflows where they move information from one platform into another, and where various projects are sort of becoming glue for each other. So things like Wikidata is increasingly used in some circles as a form of information that links different parts of their process. Next slide, please. So I think for volunteers now, this is a screenshot from the front page of Zooniverse. It's easier than ever to contribute online, to find something that scratches your itch, to find people who like the same bespoke, specialist, odd thing that you love. And I've mentioned we've got an incredible depth of experience in the field. So one of the things I love about participant forums is watching the way that people have this incredibly sophisticated language to describe new projects and analyze them when they come out. They're doing really strong work in sort of window shopping and looking at projects and seeing whether they meet the standards that they hold projects to. And there's something for everyone, whether you want to spend, go in depth and spend several months working on something intensively, or spend 5 seconds here and there via an app. The options for volunteers are fantastic. Next slide, please. And the community of practitioners has grown. So we've got some people here who are on our book sprints process, hopefully other people who've read it. I think increasingly we're aware of each other's work. There are places to gather, like the Humanities Commons, which has a group where you can share work on crowdsourcing or ask questions. On Twitter as well, there's been a lot of discourse at different times. So there's lots of places where you can go and share a problem and get new perspectives, get some sympathy, get some solutions. And the process of doing an open call for participants in the crowdsourcing handbook really showed us how many incredible practitioners there are out there. So hopefully any question that you have, someone somewhere can find you an answer. Next slide, please. So we're seeing more and more sort of really live working examples of things like repository data, so people depositing data sets in repositories, and increasingly data papers, where you write a paper that not only explains how a data set came to be, and I should apologize, I say data because I've been out of Australia for 20 years, but I've never learned to say it any other way. But data papers allow you to talk about other potential uses of a data set, and it's really a chance to explain some of the quirks that not only make up cultural heritage collections, but digitization processes, and then from there selection into crowdsourcing processes. So that's a really exciting model. And this is a screenshot from the British Library repository, where you'll see that we've credited Zooniverse volunteers. We haven't gone down the path of crediting each username individually, partly because our repository perhaps isn't quite set up for that. And I think that might be a theme that emerges throughout the symposium. But it means that Zooniverse volunteers are credited on a research repository in the British Library, and I think that's a great step forward. Next slide, please. Shout out to LC Labs and folks working with them for modeling human in the loop processes. So this is systems that combine human and computer input, and for really putting values that it's ethical, useful, and engaging right into the forefront. So I'd encourage you to go and find out more about their project. Next slide, please. I think it's a fantastic moment of reflexivity and of connection. So people are willing to learn and to share. That's become a bit harder when we can't meet in person and we can't have those side conversations and those serendipitous conversations over coffee. But events like this show that it's still possible to gather. I think we're seeing that conversations about the ethics of crowdsourcing have matured. It used to be the first question you'd get was always about data quality, and the second question was always about, isn't this taking away entry-level jobs? And I think we've moved on from that point. We always need to have an answer to this. We need to be aware of our position in the field in the same way that volunteering is aware of its position in the field. And I think we're also seeing progress on bridging the gap between theorists and practitioners. It's an incredible amount of material about best practices and ideas for interfaces and setup comes from academic fields like HCI and computer-supported cooperative work. That doesn't always make it into what practitioners know, because it takes a lot of time and some skill to read across that body of knowledge. But I think we're seeing that come together now. Next slide, please. So finally, or nearly finally, the first question was always about what about data quality? We're beyond that. People have answers for that. We've got a really sophisticated, in-depth set of answers about what data quality means in different contexts to different people. We're developing the language to be really quite thoughtful and quite precise about data quality and what we mean by it. So now we're able to focus on reuse, and I think that's such a fantastic step forward. Next slide, please. So finally, we're seeing lower barriers to entry. It's easier to get a project up and running. It's easier to get access to data from a project and think about reusing it. I think we'll find that that creates its own set of barriers. But overall, I think the fact that it's so much easier for organizations with fewer technical resources or fewer resources in general to get going is a really great point to start. And now we can start focusing on what it means to really properly do it well with our values at the front of our mind. Next slide, please. Okay, now I get to hand over.
All right. So now that Mia has demonstrated some of the really wonderful things about the current state of the field, I'm going to take some time to discuss the unintended consequences of these successes. And, just a heads up, a lot of this is really just going to be me saying a lot of what Mia said, but in a slightly more somber tone. So I think you'll be able to see those connections quite clearly. So let's start by focusing on growth. Just as Mia did earlier, as GLAM crowdsourcing becomes a realistic option for more institutions, the resulting growth can actually mean that resource allocation in particular becomes competitive. And for example, things like access to publicity or funding may be more scarce due to increased demand. If the rate of new projects that are being created rises faster than new participants can be recruited, it can mean having to vie for attention from volunteer communities. And as projects themselves scale, it also means having to find and retain dedicated staff members to not only run projects, but engage in the many other components of project management and maintenance, such as data preparation and analysis. So these are all problems of abundance, but they are problems nonetheless. We've seen this on the Zooniverse platform with ecology projects in particular. So these are sort of camera trap projects where volunteers are helping to identify animals in photographs. As the number of similarly structured projects grows, teams have started to notice their rates of classification dropping. And so in response, some of these project teams are turning to approaches like machine learning or hybrid human-computer classification methods, but that's not always a realistic option for teams, either due to lack of in-house expertise in those methods, or it's just not an appropriate option for the material that's being engaged with. On the volunteer side, the expectation to maintain or even to increase levels of engagement can be hard to meet as projects grow, particularly as more well-resourced projects in terms of staffing may actually increase expectations that other project teams will be as quick to respond. So Mia also noted that projects are now much easier to create, and I agree, this is great. It means teams aren't looking at building a bespoke project each time they want to undertake an online crowdsourcing effort. However, lowering that barrier to entry does tend to bring with it some new issues of its own. So the major barriers really are now in how to use these existing tools and platforms in a way that guarantees the results will be usable and reusable. For example, access to existing infrastructure, particularly when free and or open source, often means making some concessions or adjusting your goals to fit with the platforms that are available to you. And without proper planning and due diligence in exploring platforms, this really can lead to major challenges, many of which can go undiscovered until the participatory stage of a project is complete and a team dives into the project process of working with their project output. In Chapter 7 of the Collective Wisdom Handbook, abbreviated here as TCWH, we offer advice on how to formulate questions you can use to map your desired project components onto available tools and platforms for crowdsourcing. And we suggest approaches and define a series of needs, which may help to avoid some of the challenges listed here. So this might be a bit of a provocation, but we also need to wonder whether increased availability of easy to use platforms leads to homogeneity across projects. We ask here if more platforms mean less creativity, in the sense that people aren't having to spin up these hacky projects to make crowdsourcing a reality, but at the same time, necessity is the mother of invention. We know that there are creative ways of using available tools. We've seen it in our communities and our platforms. So perhaps a better way to formulate the question is whether more platforms mean less creativity within the form rather than about the form. And we're really thinking here about platform limitations and formulaic project building. If maintainers of a platform know that a certain approach to project building is, one, broadly successful, and two, low risk for teams running projects, they are likely to recommend it. In the case of Zooniverse, for example, custom feature development takes considerably more time than using the existing features of the platform. And so that in and of itself means that the vast majority of project builders are going to end up using those existing resources rather than partnering with us for custom feature development. There are many good things about that structure, including the fact that we can ensure new features are thoroughly tested before they're made widely available. But we do also need to consider the unintended consequences of this type of approach, particularly in the long term. So here I want to continue this theme of access and hidden labor, and acknowledge how easy access to platforms can actually obscure the actual cost of creating and running them. So the iceberg I have used here to illustrate the slide is a reminder that the public-facing component of a crowdsourcing project is often misconstrued to be the entire effort, where the bit under the water, the large chunk under the water consists of things like preparation, data cleaning, management, storage, etc. And Chapter 5 of the Collective Wisdom Handbook really is intended to help teams with this type of high-level project planning, to anticipate common issues and help to ensure that their plans fit with long-term strategies. So now that I've given multiple examples discussing how accessible platforms are, I'm going to completely flip-flop and note that workflows are still really difficult. And I don't mean workflows here in the sense of volunteer-facing project components. I mean this in the sense of how teams conceive of, design, develop, and manage their projects internally. The planning process for a crowdsourcing project does not become easier just because you aren't building a bespoke web resource. And this is why we say things like platforms aren't magic. Even if a platform is able to give you really manageable and understandable output formats like PDF or plain text files, the process of storing those in your preferred data repository is in itself complex, let alone taking into account pre-processing of images, volunteer acknowledgement, and a host of other components about these projects beyond just the part that is public facing. Following this thread of public-facing components, the social management piece of project workflows can be a major challenge as well. Caitlin Haynes, who I think is here and is speaking tomorrow, and her co-authors write that technical management and coordinated public outreach must be given the same staff attention for this kind of project to succeed. And they're absolutely right. Community management, which I've used here as an example, is only part of the public outreach process, but it requires an incredible amount of time and effort. If your project has a social or a message board component, that can be a really rich source of engagement with publics, but it requires careful moderation and a considerable amount of staff labor to succeed. And in chapter 11 of the Collective Wisdom Handbook, we share some recommendations on how to approach this type of project management, including case studies such as Brendan Wilkins' Dig Ventures project, which created, their team actually created a culture deck to help onboard new staff and transition their team members into community-focused roles. So it included information on the values of the organization and some open questions intended to stimulate discussion about how those values apply in real-world situations. So we know that built-in communities aren't always a given for crowdsourcing projects, but because some platforms have now been running for over a decade, some of them do actually have substantial sort of platform-centric communities with built-in ways of alerting those communities about when a new project or effort launches. With that said, in most cases, the majority of participants will try the project once or twice and leave. So it's really up to you to find the people who will be with you for the long term. And as these crowd sizes expand, that can become a little bit more difficult. In chapter 12 of the Collective Wisdom Handbook, we include some tips on identifying and recruiting, as well as engaging your community, while also ensuring that you're bringing your values into the community organization element of the project. So finally, I want to talk just a bit about attribution and how marketing projects as crowdsourced can unintentionally lead to obscuring the very real labor that staff also put into these efforts. This is not to say that we need to give any less focus to acknowledging volunteer efforts. That is an enormously positive thing to focus on and amplify, but we do need to make sure we are including staff efforts as well. Not only because it's the right thing to do, but because failure to do so can render that labor invisible. So acknowledgement not only gives credit where it's due, but it helps communicate effort to others who may be looking to your project as an exemplar. We all have examples of this in our own practice. Mia's earlier example of the British Library dataset actually shows that she forgot to credit herself and her team for the creation of the dataset alongside the Zooniverse volunteers. In these cases, a really strong sense of project values will help to ground your acknowledgement practices. And I'll point you here to chapter 3 of the handbook, in which we encourage readers to consider who holds power in your project and also think about what constitutes inclusion within these programs. So now I'm going to turn it over to Meghan.
Thanks, Sam. So fortunately for me, Mia and Sam have set me up to really draw some connections for incorporating data and crediting contributions in institutional repositories with those reflections on the changing shape and challenges in the broader field of crowdsourcing and cultural heritage. So I'm going to aim to somewhat swiftly touch on a couple of different approaches, including values, the range of acknowledgement and attribution, systems and their constraints, and working creatively with them, discovery, enabling reuse, and shining a light on labor. There are a lot of threads to pull here, so I'm going to do my best, and we really are hoping to hear more from you and about the discussions that you have in this workshop. So next slide, please. A quick note before we dig in, this is a bit of us hand waving. It is not the letter of the law. we're really reflecting on these broader patterns and responding in many ways to the new opportunities that are emerging within the problems of abundance that we've shared, and a changing landscape that we are right in the middle of, so we can't really see the shape as we are walking through the forest. So please take our thoughts with a grain of salt, because we haven't been situated in your context, and we may not have faced the technical or resource or time constraints that you may experience. And a few things that we keep in mind in our work: people are at the heart of these endeavors, and we are going to need to continue to bring creativity and problem solving to the next waves of crowdsourcing and digitally enabled participation. And also, we try to remember in all cases that our mileage may vary, but we're still ready to ride. So next slide, please. We, as you have heard us say several times in this presentation, we really believe it's imperative to articulate and proactively operationalize your values. We're really fortunate to be undertaking these collaborative projects in a time where values-based practice really is common, and examples of aligning practice to principles abound. So you can really look across the field and pull out specific examples, or even just ask somebody, what was a time that you had to, kind of match your values to your practice? In the Collective Wisdom Handbook, Sam sketched out the complexity of the forces at play with crowdsourcing projects. You can see in this image a ship at sea, a little sailboat, and the various pressures that are being applied to the project. And values in this case really can serve as a North Star for prioritization and help you set the course for the ways the project can unfold. And it will take, of course, effort and attention and discussion and reflection to keep those values connected to the challenges that you might encounter. We also, as we've touched on earlier, these values can help you check temptations and stem pressure, particularly when something is maybe technically possible, but complex ethically and practically. And even if you were going to undertake it, you need a lot more time and a lot more consultation with communities or colleagues, or where shortcuts sometimes seem appealing. Furthermore, the fact that this symposium is being convened and convening around these topics is really a step in a direction that wasn't possible even a few years ago. And the fact that you're all sharing your experiences and benefiting one another is inspiring as an example of enacting a set of values that are often implicit in this work, which is chiefly that we would all like to do this work well and help other people with their practice, because we care about the people, the stories, the data, systems that catalyze transformations via crowdsourcing. Next slide, please. So there really is a vast spectrum of possibility when it comes to crediting participants. And I think that's really such an exciting part of what's being discussed in the symposium. And it might be from the hats off kind of acknowledgement and shows of gratitude to really formal accreditation that can be used in particular ways by participants. And perhaps there's even a connection between the approach that you take and what the contributions might enable, such as discovery or access or research or new methods. And I will briefly just say I feel called upon to reflect on the context of the symposium and how project and data design create space for certain forms of acknowledgement, and to use that word specifically to bring forward the values of transparency and equity that can be possible in crowdsourcing practice as well. So we can carry these values forward into practice to ground contribution in various forms of data, which is really powerful and at times radical. Radical as an excellent cool, but also as transformational and counter to prevailing practices. For example, in Zooniverse, there are best practices for giving credit to discoveries, which is frequently used in astrophysics projects where volunteers have been co-authors on peer-reviewed papers for discovering planetary systems and celestial objects, and even in settings where volunteers can enter their preferred name for acknowledgement. And from the page, of course, also features page-level individual accreditation and versioning of contributions as well, which surfaces a whole new dimension of contribution and community. And in the case of large-scale crowdsourcing platforms like the Smithsonian Transcription Center and by the people at the Library of Congress, participants and their efforts have been credited in ways that are integrated as metadata or augmenting data discoverable within the systems that steward the data that those participants have helped to create. So these forms of accreditation and acknowledgement are part of a broader system of contribution and explicit and implicit rewards too, and connecting to those participant motivations that we frequently talk about when we are designing or beginning to think about undertaking this work. And I think that altogether comprehensively, it really can prompt a provocation of what's next when it comes to crediting contribution. Next slide, please. Okay, so we see juicy challenges on the horizon for managing people and data and the systems in which they are all connected as the field and these practices mature. And if we were thinking about integrating crowdsourcing outcomes, we probably are thinking about a blend of our own systems, the crowdsourcing, our own institutional repositories, I guess we could say, our crowdsourcing systems that we are designing or we are linking together in various workflows, and the data models that are a part of that. And then we are probably also thinking about systems and knowledge repositories we don't manage where data may flourish, and how do we carry forward the acknowledgement of those types of contributions. So you have probably grappled with all of these challenges at play, including managing and preparing data for source systems like content management systems, designing workflows and data models, and perhaps unpicking data models as well when you are looking at new workflows, indexing and correlating data that is a result of these crowdsourcing workflows, and documenting and packaging data for use beyond your own systems, and of course, probably a suite of boutique challenges as well. So as we look ahead to the next set of constraint bending approaches, I really want to put a bit out, as Mia included as well, to embrace and integrate interdisciplinary expertise and really think about who can help you with this work. It may not be the first set of people that you think of, but there's a wide range of knowledge and expertise that you can bring into your practice. Next slide, please. So we're going to touch on from the systems, what we're just talking about there, to what they make possible, touch on an example from Shakespeare's world, which is an intriguing example that comes to mind for us when we think about really doing attribution well and where there's more possibility. And my former colleague, Dr. Victoria Van Heining, who's on this call, is participating, sharing more this week, specifically about Shakespeare's world. So hopefully this example sparks some great questions for her too. So as volunteers contributed to the Folger Library and Zooniverse project Shakespeare's World, a volunteer using the name Mutability discovered an early example of the phrase white lie. Since I do not wish to diminish the details of this antedating to the Oxford English Dictionary, which is an active attribution in itself, and I don't want to inadvertently leave steps out, I'm going to pick up again when the entry for white lie has already been created. So next slide, please. And here's where an intriguing wrinkle emerges. So even with the Oxford English Dictionary's long history of pre-digital crowdsourcing, we don't really see any attribution to the people who submitted examples. You do see some kind of authorship attribution with the definitions that are included here. So next slide, please, Sam. So the Oxford English Dictionary doesn't attribute individuals who are reporting definitions, but we do see a lot of other ways that Shakespeare's World and the Oxford English Dictionary acknowledge this contribution to the public record. And we should also note that the process of validating antedating is also requires a huge volume of research and verification, all also largely unacknowledged. So we have a lot of work to go, I think, comprehensively in thinking about this. But from crediting the volunteer explicitly to the overarching project outcomes and then integration in the source and reference system, this example shows us a lot and gives us an opportunity to think about what could be next and where and how some of these forms of data and those types of attributions or accreditations might intersect. Next slide, please. Okay, so we want to leave you with two final provocations. First, how does post-collaborative processing as well as project design impact project outcomes, the outcomes, use, and reuse? And secondly, how to render contributions and activities legible so greater awareness emerges about the many minds involved in these practices. And Sam touched on that second one earlier. So the first one first. In the first case, as more data are available for use, we really do need to place a deeper attention to helping people understand how data were created, with what goals and expectations, because it may, if we don't, we're obscuring potential absences or the depth of activity that's included, by whom, of course, that's one of the big discussion points here, and also possibly even suggest expected uses and barriers that users can expect to encounter. And this is a place where we'd love to continue to have conversations with you all and help enhance the field. And we're seeing great examples, as Mia already acknowledged earlier, of examples of data papers. One example I would give from our LC Labs context is our Computing Cultural Heritage in the Cloud initiative, where we had one computational researcher who wished to use some text that was created by the People volunteers as part of a data visualization. And the method that this researcher was using attempted to map similarity of documents to one another. She saw a huge cluster of documents and was like, wow, there must be really interesting topic happening here. But looking more closely, it was actually the attribution that was included in the text that pulled those documents together and skewed the algorithmic representation. And that's just one, it's solved by data cleaning, but it's just one example of an unintended use and a way that we can begin to think about what might be on the horizon for use and how we include attribution and connect it in here. Next slide, please. So Sam and Mia throughout this presentation have touched on the ways that public communication and even internal persuasive communication might emphasize participants and their successes. And shout out to Sam from earlier, we want to continue to do that. That is the goal. But it does inadvertently obscure project team contributions or the large body of practices that have enabled this to even happen. So you as a person who is managing or stewarding or designing crowdsourcing projects will probably have a view of who's contributing to the broad success of your project. And you are also likely to be the invisible bridge between people's labor and the systems that hold those outcomes. In the collective wisdom discussions, we're really reflecting on what could come next in acknowledging people and practices and data flows, and also pulling in those interdisciplinary expertise as we mentioned. And we really want to think, how can we better convey in more visible ways the impact of participants and also what's been made possible by staff and partners too? How can we make that more legible to leadership, to funders, and to our peers, and help lift practice across the field? So you and we as a wider community should really be prepared for unexpected outcomes and serendipity as much as we need to prepare for the goals we set out for ourselves. Next slide, please. Which is the last slide. So in this talk and in the Collective Wisdom Project, we've described a state of field that offers a really strong stepping off point to tackle the next crop of collective challenges in collaborative transcription. Creativity and practical steps are really needed for this next level of use of data, supporting participants and assuring the good work and the design that enables projects is fully represented right alongside the outcomes and the benefits of those endeavors too. So we hope the provocations we've shared and the oversight that the overview we've provided really might contribute to your design and the ways that you'll manage relationships and data as you complete your project objectives. And we are wishing you luck and hoping for more chances to learn from you all as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mia, Sam, and Megan for sharing your project with us, but then also just giving us a very thorough overarching overview of the state of the field, collaborative field. I definitely learned a lot. I have a couple of questions that I want to ask, but before I chime in, I do want to open the floor for everybody else to be able to ask the questions that have emerged while the presentation was taking place. You are free to unmute yourself and ask the question. You can also add it to the chat, whatever makes you feel more comfortable.
If you don't mind, I'll start.
Yeah.
I was, as you'll hear in the next session, I'm really invested in values in the context of research and in engaging both with communities in and outside of the academy. And I was really inspired and excited to see you mentioned values right up front as part of the foundations of project design. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you approach sort of documenting and establishing those values, if there is a method that you've used for creating a values document as part of project development, and how you go about sort of getting consensus among sort of the core team of collaborators, some of whom are going to come from radically different positions, positionalities within their institutions. You'll have faculty and staff and sometimes graduate students or others. So how do you work to develop and clarify those values so that they're operating in an equitable way and not sort of being a top-down dictate from those with the most institutional power?
I can maybe speak to how we've approached it on a project called Living with Machines, with its data science applied in the context of a library. Many digital humanities projects have like a project charter, and that's one way of documenting what your values are. The British Library has a really strong set of values. So in our performance reviews, you bring in how you've embodied those values. But I think it's about creating a space where you have to set aside the institutional authority and allow for the fact that values are going to look different depending on who you are. So for some projects, for early career researchers, they want to keep everything back and publish it in a kind of big bang thing and get the best possible line they can do on their CV. And then I have to negotiate with them from my perspective that we're working with the public to create data. So I should be sharing back as transparently and as often as early as I can. So we sort of negotiate until we find something that works for both groups. I'm a co-investigator, so I could, if I wanted to, override them, I guess, but that wouldn't be living my values and it wouldn't be living the values of the project. But I think it's creating that space where you can negotiate and work towards a compromise that actually works for everyone as much as possible. And it really takes time, and it takes a lot of exposure to each other's language and ways of thinking about the world to find hidden pockets of places where your values might not coincide, but you might not realize it until you're right deep in the middle of something. So I think creating time and using structures that allow voices to be heard regardless of like who they're attached to. So things like silent writing and then sharing ideas can be one way of getting ideas out there without that sort of those issues coming in. I'm sure the others have got things.
Yeah, just
go ahead, Maggie.
I was just going to say somewhat comparable process for our LC Labs Computing Cultural Heritage in the Cloud initiative. One thing that we add in as a dimension is we have arbitrarily broken this grant project up into 6 phases, and at the end of each phase, at the start of each phase and at the end of each phase, we look at what our values were in that previous phase and how we were undertaking the work and thinking about, do we need to add more? And what has happened, of course, is as we are pivoting what it is that we're doing, there become new dimensions that we need to consider or add in, or we find where there was tension around a value. So I'll put a blog post into the chat. We did that through, as Mia suggested, through some scaffolded workshops, and then allowed those documents to kind of be open documents that people could edit. And then we surfaced them with other, so we did this as part of the core team, and then we brought the same document set of values into a couple of workshops with other colleagues and researchers who were undertaking work with us, and they added in additional values.
And just to sort of round this out, I can speak a little bit to training project builders and the ways that I work this into training workshops. I'm running an Institute for Advanced Topics in Digital Humanities, which is also NEH funded. And one of the approaches we've taken, particularly when it comes to members of our cohort who are interested in having students work on these projects. I start by assigning them your chapter from Disrupting DH, Spencer. It's an invaluable piece of work. And then I think the way that I encourage them to approach it is through a concept of shared expectations. A values statement beyond being what it says in terms of articulating values is also just a really good way to make sure that everyone has a good understanding of how something is mutually beneficial. You can call a project mutually beneficial, but if 2 people have a different understanding of what their purported benefit is going to be, someone's going to be disappointed when that doesn't sync up. So thinking of the value statement not as a contract, but as just a way of setting shared expectations as well, because then that leads to people being able to make informed decisions about whether or not they want to participate. And that sets up the stage for being able to opt in and break down the power dynamics of coercion. So yeah, if for those of you in the audience who haven't read Spencer's chapter, please do. It's great.
Thank you, Spencer. Any other questions? I had one yes, Victoria. And thank you, by the way, for note taking.
Oh yeah, no problem. It's exciting in that document. But I wanted to ask a question about, there's sort of a wider discussion about how do we discuss acknowledged labor and cultural heritage more broadly, and I think you touched on that. And one of the pain points you talked about, I think, Meghan, was the kind of lack of space in CMSs for that particular kind of metadata. But I think that crowdsourcing is so fruitful because it puts pressure on some of that invisible labor that shot through our organizations. And yeah, I think I'm like slightly elaborating, slightly asking you to say more on that. Yeah, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
I reflect on it from a person who's not trained in the professional practices that are happening within the organization that I'm a part of. So I bring a different disciplinary background. I think that crowdsourcing activities, which I find is adjacent and augmenting to more professionalized practice in libraries and archives and museums, helps to refine and sometimes causes tension or questions around what types of activities constitute labor, or what is the authoritative practice and how does that play out. And I think Mia touched on this earlier. We've mostly kind of moved past some of those discussions in the field, as you all are aware. But actually it surfaces the deep complexity of the types of expertise and knowledge and skill that the people with whom I'm privileged to work with every day bring to help us steward or build out these different types of projects. So I think that I find it an interesting tension, because the first instinct is to feel that tension, but if you kind of lean into that a little bit more closely, you have the opportunity to see the ways that these different sets of actions and activities from people who have expertise in other fields that they bring into these projects shine a light on those experiences. So it might just be kind of another restatement of what you said, Victoria, but hopefully that's helpful.
Mia, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that's thank you for that question. That was partly a comment, because it is such an important way of thinking about who our systems are for. We sort of overload their functions, their discovery, they record moves between departments, they record conservation, and we should be pushing always to make them be more human. And I think, underneath all these systems, we always have to be mindful of the impact on people and people within organizations and without, and even if it's purely in terms of the history of the information in a record, you want some sense of where that's come from. So I think we should be pushing at these systems. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to add a final comment there, there's another AHRC funded project that I'm part of called Engaging Crowds, which is it was one of the first round of projects funded by the Towards a National Collection funding scheme in the UK. And there was a workshop that we held as part of that effort called After the Crowds Disperse, very similar theme to the symposium today. And one of the recommendations that came out of that workshop was actually for people to work with the companies that are creating systems and actually be in communication to have those conversations rather than trying to sort of hack the technology that we have. Let's go to the source and think about how we can change it fundamentally as well.
Thank you, Victoria, again for that question. Any other questions? Kind of want to add to that conversation. One thing that Alyssa and we've been talking about, not only as part of this project, but then also with our coworkers. And you're absolutely right. In terms of what you discussed, we need to, we really need to make a major effort in terms of not only acknowledging contributors or collaborators, which is also another question that I have for you all in terms of how people are deciding how to identify participants in crowdsourcing projects, but then also the value and the necessity to be able to also acknowledge the staff work that goes in there, right? In terms of assessing quality, doing corrections, bringing them into our systems, doing the metadata, right? There's a lot that goes into that that we've been really talking about. And I think Victoria somebody mentioned that the schema, right, that we're working with, the metadata schema, doesn't really allow for us to be able to essentially acknowledge the metadata, right, for the creation of this digital object, which I'll talk a little bit about our approach in the third session. But I think it's super important, right, to be able to acknowledge this in the record, the hidden labor, right, that goes into coordinating, but then also the labor that comes into transcribing. My main question, I know that you, Sam, I think you said this right, where I think those questions in terms of, you know, valuing that labor, you know, we've gone beyond that as professionals who engage with these type of projects. But I feel like that's a question that we still get for our admins, right? In terms, you know, what do you mean transcribing? That doesn't really take much effort, right? I guess, and this might be in the chapters that you all have elaborated on or created with your co-authors, but I'm wondering if you can provide examples or strategies that folks have shared in terms of how to answer that question to admin, to be able to beef up resources, right, that help us do the ethical work, right, of acknowledging a collective pool of labor. Sorry, I think my question got lost in there. Any strategies? Any strategies that you noticed from the articles that were contributed that you can maybe talk a little bit about in terms of how to advocate for this type of work for admin?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, from my perspective, I'm sure Mia and Megan have additional strategies as well, but I work with a lot of scientists, and I really try whenever possible to follow the completely acceptable model from the sort of STEM publication world of just being extremely inclusive with authorship. Astrophysics papers will include Zooniverse web developers who created the infrastructure that was used to generate the data that was analyzed in the paper. They will include, you know, volunteers who first pointed out potential candidates that were later found and confirmed to be planetary systems. They include people like me who are humanities, you know, colleagues who read and helped revise sections of a paper, even though it's nowhere near my specialist discipline. And I think there's a sense of looking down at that practice from the humanities field. We kind of get these comically long authorship lists, but I really don't think that's a problem. I think that actually shows us how much work goes into creating that product. And I think that's something we should celebrate rather than try to hide or try to sort of write off by putting these big, long acknowledgements at the start of a paper. Get rid of those. Just add people as co-authors. That's my take. I'm sure it's overly simplistic when I say it in this way, but I think if we want to actually help to create a sea change in the field, we need to just start doing it also.
The bit I would add in is about thinking a little bit more holistically or comprehensively about the ways that people will find data and connect with it. So thinking about connecting to knowledge repositories. I see Jason's on the call here, and I think Caitlin could probably speak to examples from the Smithsonian Transcription Center as well. But one thing that comes to mind from my earlier days with the Smithsonian Transcription Center was not about contributors, but people who had contributed to the scientific record, but were not acknowledged. So female collectors who were acknowledged by their husbands' names. And there was no place to put the acknowledgement of their names within existing source systems. So we took a different approach by trying to represent them within the Wikimedia ecosystem, so that if people were searching the discovery, the broader experience of discovery would allow that sort of information to rise. And I don't know if there's a parallel or an easy connection between recognizing the large volume of contributors, but maybe something that is in that sort of within the systems, but also within intersecting systems as a way of describing or acknowledging contribution. Maybe that's something we can all work on together and try to make some steps in that direction.
I think it's a very live issue in some of the work that I do, and that's partly because we do have early career researchers, research software engineers, and other specialists who might be relying on authorship to get them CV lines. And I think it becomes really tricky unless you're able to disentangle authorship from credit, from career advancement, from promotion prospects, and from just simply acknowledging the fact that people have contributed work towards things. And authorship means really, really different things, where got research software engineers who want authorship credit on something that they definitely contributed to, but they're not taking part in the intellectual work of translating the meaning of what's been found. And for some of the scholars, that authorship is different than the authorship of creating software and developing workflows that enable that work. And we need better ways to think about that. We started to think about it in Living with Machines, and I put a link in the chat. But I think just taking a step back and thinking about what does credit mean to people, like what does it enable for them? What does sharing credit disable for them? For some people, single authored papers or monographs are really important. It's a massively competitive academic job market, but for other people, it's just a fantastic acknowledgement of the fact that they've spent 20 years spending rainy Saturdays typing in index text. So it means really different things to different people, and we need to be really mindful of how it operates in different contexts. So I certainly don't have any answers, except it's complicated.
Thank you all. Caitlin, you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of follow up on your question, Albert, and this is all just, I just have to squeal in general because this is just amazing and energizing, and thank you guys for all of this. Fangirling on all of you as usual in these conversations. But in terms of just sort of circling back a little bit to your question about strategy, like when talking to leadership around kind of implementing some of this stuff or figuring out how to better prioritize some of this stuff, you know, this is an issue that we run into all the time at the Smithsonian. Meghan can definitely understand that, but our program was definitely built almost a decade ago as something that was like really set up from a technical perspective and really relied on this idea of like, you know, if you build it, they will come, because we have the Smithsonian name and we don't have to really think critically or strategically about the community aspect of it, right? And we've sort of continued to struggle with that, not because our leadership doesn't care, but because they just fundamentally don't understand, because we're in a technical unit, right? So they don't, you know, they're not even speaking the same language as us when it comes to community management or acknowledgement or engagement in any way. And so, you know, over the past 4 years, I've really struggled to figure out how to kind of figure out how to translate that messaging to them, right? And one thing that we've done is, and we're a tiny staff, it was just one person for 8 years, and then now it's 2 people for the past 2 years. And one thing that we've done is just like documentation, and, you know, continuing to sort of note the feedback that we're getting from our volunteers, but also our internal collaborators, and kind of crafting proposals and strategies that encompass this, that then we can present to leadership. The one thing that we did last year in 2021 was we created our first strategic plan that incorporated a lot of core values, and we like cited the Collective Wisdom Handbook. Thank you guys for that. To be able to say like, look, we're not pulling this out of our butts, right? This is legitimate in the field. Like these are the conversations, these are the things that we need to be thinking about across the board. And here, like, this is where this is coming from our communities. This is where it's coming from our staff. This is where it's coming from the field. And this is why these things are really important, not only when we think about acknowledgement, but also when we think about I love that you talked about labor, literally like the skilled aspects of these things, but also one thing that we really prioritized in putting into our core values was acknowledging the emotional labor that goes into close engagement with historical documents, right? And so what does that mean for our projects and for our site? It means that thinking really strategically and critically about the content that is appropriate for this kind of work, and making sure that we're contextualizing those materials as well for our volunteers, not only incorporating the work that goes into all of this to get it into Transcription Center, to acknowledge the labor of our colleagues, but also making sure that we're not just putting up some historical documentation on the transatlantic slave trade without any contextual information, without any resources for learning more, without any ways to communicate with us and staff about how to kind of understand and grapple with this history, without any disclaimers, without a cultural sensitivity information, and really kind of crafting that. And we put this all in and we gave it to our CIO and he signed off on the strategic plan. And so that's helping us sort of craft, moving forward with our units and our public volunteers, new policies as we move forward that align with all of these values. So we're more easily able to say, well, no, we do have boundaries on what's going to go into Transcription Center, and we're not going to put up native content without community collaboration, right? So having, and I know that a lot of that is chicken and the egg, but it's really helped us to just sort of like do it. Like Sam said, like sometimes you just got to do it and put it down on paper and like get those proposals really hammered out. And I think we kind of stalled on that a little bit in Transcription Center in the past because we were like, well, they're not asking for it. They don't want to engage with it. They don't understand. But it really surprised us. And I know this isn't always the case, but it really surprised us that once we were able to lay things out in kind of very polished proposals and strategic plans and gave it to our leadership in that format, they were much more willing to be like, oh yeah, great, sure, we don't know what that is, but that looks lovely, and then we can sort of go back and be like, look, you guys signed off on this, now we can craft more policies, right? And it's working to our benefit. So that's just sort of my take on that. But I could talk all day as well.
Thank you, Caitlin. Actually, yeah, I never really thought about bringing the work, right, and as a strategy point, right, that we can add to our strategic planning. We're actually about to get into that, so I'll think about that as I'm thinking about some of these points. Any other questions for our, yes, Victoria?
I have a question, but I also don't want to jump in if anybody else who hasn't spoken wants to say anything. Anybody? Okay, so my question kind of connects with, or it's an extension of the attribution and how do we sort of count things and so on. And one of the questions that actually came up while I was at the Library of Congress in the manuscript division was, how do we even understand online access of collections, which we assume would be facilitated more clearly, direct pathway to the page via the transcription in ways that, were never possible before with just a finding aid and digital images. And are institutions even tracking, counting, trying to understand, trying to quantify, time on page or hits, that again, crowdsourcing might be increasing? Because I think that's a really important part of the conversation with leadership about seeing the value of labor that everybody is involved in, everybody's doing in ways that are, traditional, like foot traffic types of questions, at least the way that it was in the manuscript division when I was there, which is now a couple of years ago. So I'd love to hear if anybody's had a story about that.
I haven't really thought about that. That's a good point in terms of framing it as a traditional, or had been traditionally tracked. But that would be a good approach in terms of calculating those hours that are being contributed not only from our public, right, but then also internally. Has anybody done that or thought about that as an approach?
Well, I just wanted to chime in and say that can be really useful, but then there's also the challenge where it's really important to, let's say, transcribe an entire corpus, but then what people might find really interesting about that, it ends up being 2 pages. I'm an early modernist, and people are always going to go for the thing marked Shakespeare, even though that's not actually but that it doesn't actually reflect the early modern literary past. So we need to have the rest of these documents digitized so we can see what's alongside the Shakespeare, or even not even with the Shakespeare. And so there's also like, so I would be wary about doing some of that kind of quantification work, because the other thing that that does is it points to like how big are certain fields of study, right? Like as soon as you put humanities up against astrophysics, our data is smaller, and maybe the number of API requests are smaller and things like that. But that doesn't mean that it's not valuable to have these very specific hard transcriptions that reflect, as we've been talking about, a ton of work.
I think, sorry if I can jump back in and sort of clarify or respond to that a little bit. I think if it were, as you know, frankly weaponized in the way that you anticipate with that comment, I think that would be a problem, but I don't see it as being any different from the way that institutions track collections use already. And I think tracking kind of virtual pathways or virtual access is just an expansion and would hopefully show actually greater value and greater engagement with materials than we are currently able to see, at least from the way I understand how a lot of cultural heritage institutions like report usage figures. So.
Sorry, yeah, I'll ping in a bit, but Victoria, just to clarify, are you posing that as a potential strategy for admin or for the public to engage the public?
I'm talking about for the stories that we tell internally. So like we already have people accessing collections in our reading rooms, and now we're augmenting that story with a whole host of people are accessing the same materials online using these pathways that have been created through crowdsourcing. So it's making the labor visible and the access visible in new ways. It's not comparing collections against some other bar. It's just saying like, we're already doing these measures and we're not capturing this, like what I assume is a very significant mode of access and kind of depth of engagement. It's just for some institutions, like still kind of invisible. And that seems like a missed opportunity to me.
Just following up on that quickly, that at Library Partners right now, we actually are doing some impact evaluation work, and some of it is looking really directly at that of the digital collections and via web metrics, how much use, how deep are people going, what were they looking at before, and for those collections where we've now been able to return transcriptions, what's the difference, and being able to look sort of across at changes. Obviously, there's some difficulties there. There's a lot within web metrics that does and doesn't work for that kind of evaluation. So we're hoping eventually to have some hard data and to publish about that, but we're looking at that now, sort of.
Sorry, that would be amazing. I just wanted to go back to Victoria's thing briefly, and there's always an issue where institutions that have reading rooms or galleries or exhibition spaces or some kind of venue space will think that the people that they can physically poke are real people, and they forget that anyone interacting with them online isn't a real person. We don't see that quite so much in social media because there'll be a Twitter profile or a Facebook profile or something that they can see. That definitely gets shared in my institution, but comments, at the moment, we don't have a path for feeding comments from people crowdsourcing into those dashboards and those reports. So I think you always have to be very careful about what you measure and how you share what you measure, but just to do that kind of deficit work in terms of saying there are thousands of people who have quite a deep relationship with our collections as compared to people in the reading rooms. It's kind of equivalent sometimes in terms of how much time they actually spend looking at collection items. We need to bring them into the conversation. They need to be visible in the institution as well.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, I want to thank Mia, Megan, and Sam again for sharing their project with us.